High-intensity training is making a comeback. According to social media, Mike Mentzer might have discovered the secret to building muscle 40 years ago. Some people argue his heavy-duty system was decades ahead of its time, but others believe it has been taken so far that it's become an extreme philosophy rather than an effective training method. So who's right? Was Mike Mentzer one of the greatest innovators of bodybuilding history? Or is social media oversimplifying what he actually taught? To answer that, we actually have to discuss a few people. We have to separate what Arthur Jones originally taught, what Mike Mentzer explained, what Dorian Yates actually did, and what the internet turned it into. Now, before we go any further, I want to clear up one simple point. HIT, H-I-T, is not HIT, H-I-I-T. HIIT stands for High Intensity Interval Training and usually refers to short bursts of intense cardio, followed by periods of recovery. HIT, on the other hand, stands for High Intensity Training. It's a philosophy of resistance training built around one simple philosophical idea: train with maximum effort. Take your muscle to failure or as close to failure as possible, and use less overall training volume. At first glance, that sounds simple, but over the last 50 years, HIT has become one of the most controversial philosophies in bodybuilding. Supporters claim that you only need a handful of incredibly brutal sets to build an incredible physique. Critics argue that many of its later recommendations became so extreme that it actually limited progress. The truth is far more interesting than either side actually wants to admit. To understand why high-intensity training still sparks debate today, we have to go back to the 1970s, when one man challenged nearly everything the bodybuilding world believed about building muscle. His name was Arthur Jones. When Arthur Jones entered the bodybuilding world in the 1970s, one philosophy dominated: more was better. The most popular bodybuilding programs at that time included 20 or more sets for their bodybuilding program, and bodybuilders would spend hours in a gym. High volume routines were popularized through magazines and through people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, whose workouts became the gold standard for aspiring bodybuilders. It's also important to understand the context of that time. Anabolic steroid use had become increasingly common in professional bodybuilding. Enhanced athletes could recover from an enormous amount of training volume. But that idea was rarely shared with the general public when they shared their workout routines. Recreational lifters often copied these routines without realizing that they did not have the same recovery capacity as the professional bodybuilders. Arthur Jones believed there was a better way. Instead of asking how much work can you do, he asked a better question: how little training could you perform while still optimizing maximum muscle growth? Arthur Jones didn't believe that your muscles grow because you perform dozens of sets. He believed that they grow because they're exposed to a certain stimulus and then allowed to recover. For Jones, that stimulus was training with very high effort. He believed each working set should be taken to the absolute training failure, to the point where when you are trying to push with the maximum effort you can and no weight is lifting, I'm talking failure. Of course, asterisks with good form. He argued that if a set was truly that difficult, then there would be no reason to perform additional sets. That instead of accumulating more volume, that lifters should acquire to make their workouts meaningful. Make every workout count. Jones also didn't just change how people trained. He trained the very equipment people worked out on. He invented the Nautilus machine, named after the spiral shell because of its distinctive cam-shaped resistance system. Unlike traditional machines, Nautilus used specialized design cams that varied the resistance throughout each repetition to better match the body's natural strength curve. The goal was to keep tension on the target muscle through a greater portion of the movement, instead of allowing resistance to become easier at certain points in the range of motion. Many modern resistance machines use this same concept. Jones also introduced a technique called pre-exhaustion. The idea was simple: perform an isolated exercise first to fatigue the targeted muscle, then immediately perform a compound movement that targets that same muscle. For example, instead of just starting with the chest press, you would first perform pec deck flies until your chest was fatigued. then move directly into your chest press. The theory was that your chest would reach failure before your shoulders or your triceps ever became a fatiguing factor beforehand. Whether pre-exhaustion is necessary is still debated by bodybuilders today, but many people still use it and swear by it. Probably the most famous demonstration of Jones's philosophy was in the 1973 Colorado experiment. Jones supervised bodybuilder Casey Viator through a brief but very intense and rigorous training program after he had been ill and lost some muscle and taken a break from working out. Over the course of several weeks, Viator reported an astonishing amount of muscle gain, and he was training at very low volume with extremely high intensity. The results generated enormous attention for high intensity training and launched it into the mainstream. Despite the publicity, the Colorado experiment does have some important limitations to discuss. Casey Viator was not just an average lifter, he was an intense professional bodybuilder. He was an elite bodybuilder who had previously built a phenomenal physique. Much of the muscle that he regained was likely from muscle memory, allowing him to rebuild tissue muscle faster than someone that's starting from scratch. It also involved only one athlete and wasn't in a randomized controlled study like you might see in an ideal scientific program. Even so, Arthur Jones accomplished something that permanently changed the bodybuilding world and how people train today. He challenged the assumption that more volume means automatically more muscle. He argued that intensity, progressive overload, and recovery deserved far more attention than just counting sets. And more than 50 years later, the debate still shapes how people train today. Arthur Jones created high-intensity training, and Mike Mentzer would make it famous. Mentzer was already an exceptional bodybuilder well before discovering Arthur Jones's philosophy and ideas. He had outstanding genetics, had built a phenomenal physique using traditional bodybuilding methods, and quickly established himself as one of the stars of the bodybuilding world. After suffering a shoulder injury, Mentzer was introduced to Arthur Jones's ideas. In fact, Casey Viator introduced him to it. Jones's emphasis on low training volume and high intensity really resonated with him. Mentzer didn't just simply adopt Jones's ideas, he expanded them. Like Jones, Mentzer believed that muscles respond to intensity instead of just volume. If a set is performed with maximum effort, he argued, additional sets often produce more fatigue than additional growth. The philosophy became the foundation of what he called heavy-duty training. Heavy duty emphasized relatively few working sets taken to true muscle failure. A typical workout might only include 1 or 2 sets of all-out exercises, often using advanced techniques like pre-exhaustion, forced repetition, or negative reps to push beyond conventional failure. The goal was to create the greatest possible muscle stimulus with the least amount of work. Mentzer's competitive career took a turning point in the 1980 Olympia. The results remain one of the most controversial bodybuilding results of all history. Arnold Schwarzenegger returned after several years away from the field and won first place. Mentzer finished 7th. Many competitors believe Arnold should not have won and that Mentzer deserved a higher placing than what he received. Critics also point to a potential conflict of interest because Joe Weider promoted both Mr. Olympia competitions and Arnold himself through the magazines. Whether the judging was unfair is still debated today. But for Mentzer, the heartbreak was astronomical. Disillusioned with bodybuilding, he walked away from the stage forever, and he devoted the rest of his career to teaching and refining heavy-duty training. Interestingly, the heavy-duty programs that Mentzer pushed in the beginning were less extreme than people think nowadays. His beginner routines resemble programs that many coaches recommend still today. They typically involve 3 days of total body training per week, with 1 or 2 challenging sets per exercise. Intermediate trainers often train for 4 days a week, using an upper-lower split, while maintaining relatively moderate weekly training volume. The defining feature wasn't the number of exercises. It was the effort. Mentzer expected every single workout to be performed with extreme intensity and absolute maximum effort. As lifters became more advanced, he did not recommend more volume. Instead, he would push them through forced repetitions or pre-exhaustion or negatives. He still kept the number of working sets relatively low. Over time, however, Mentzer's programs became more and more extreme. By the time he published Heavy Duty in 1993, he was recommending dramatically lower training volumes and much lower training frequencies than Arthur Jones had originally proposed. Some programs trained a muscle only once every 5 to 7 days, while some of his later writings recommended even longer recovery periods. He also made claims that many exercise scientists today reject. This includes that someone could reach their genetic potential within just a couple of months within the heavy-duty training program. Modern research does not support these conclusions. Current evidence suggests that muscle can be built over a variety of volumes and repetitions. Most studies show, too, that taking your muscle to absolute failure isn't necessary for muscle growth. In fact, you can stop 1 or 2 reps before that, and you'll get practically the same results and get less fatigued. However, some of Mentzer's conclusions hold up remarkably well today. Research shows that hard, stimulating sets pushed to failure does make muscle grow. It also supports the idea that as training intensity increases, the volume doesn't necessarily have to be as high. In other words, Mentzer was right that at least quality matters than the amount of sets. Where many experts believe that he went too far is reducing the volume in training to the extreme that he did. Heavy duty remains one of the most influential training systems ever created. But understanding the recommendations of Mentzer's early works to what was later produced is pretty critical. The distinction becomes even more important as we look at Olympian bodybuilders that have taken high-intensity training successfully to the Olympia stage, such as Dorian Yates. If Mike Mentzer's idea of high-intensity training was popularized, it was taken to the next level with Yates. He was simply proof of the concept. Between 1992 and 1997, Yates won 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles while following a training system he called blood and guts. His success convinced an entire generation of bodybuilders that low volume, high intensity training could produce championship level results. But despite the comparisons, Dorian didn't just simply copy Mike Mentzer. His version of HIT was far more practical. One of the biggest misconceptions of blood and guts is that Yates only performed 1 set per exercise. That's not actually what happened. Before every all-out working set, Dorian completed several progressively heavier warm-up sets. These were not taken to failure. The idea was to help the muscles, joints, and nervous system to be warmed up for the set that truly mattered. Only after those warm-up sets would he complete his 1 solo set to all-out maximum effort failure. On many of the exercises, then a training partner or a spotter would help him push it further beyond that 1 failure set to get a few more extra reps in with assistance. That distinction is important. He was not advocating walking into the gym, picking up the heaviest weight possible, performing 1 set, putting it down, and leaving. He believed the body should be prepared first before pouring everything into that maximum effort set. Another difference was his exercise selection. Mentzer often recommended a very limited number of exercises, believing only a few movements were necessary. Dorian took a different approach. Rather than performing similar exercises, he hit the muscle at different angles to help stimulate growth. A back workout, for example, might include rows for mid-back thickness, pull-downs for vertical pulling strength, machine rows for stabilities, and pullovers to isolate the lats. Instead of performing several versions of the same movement, every exercise served a distinct purpose. The same philosophy appeared throughout his program. For chest, legs, shoulders, you name it, he chose exercises that complemented each other biomechanically. He wasn't just simply adding volume. And as his career progressed, Dorian also relied more heavily on machines. Some people interpreted this as him abandoning free weights, but that really wasn't the case. His goal wasn't to prove that machines were superior. His goal was to maximize muscle stimulation while reducing risk. For example, he experienced some back pain, so he replaced barbell back squats with Smith machine squats. Allowed him to focus on his quadriceps with putting less strain on his back. Remember, bodybuilders are training muscles, whereas athletes are training movement. And that distinction is important when you're lifting weights, which is why a bodybuilder could switch over to something like a Smith machine, because the entire point of his athletic career is not to squat the most, it's to look like he could squat the most. A powerlifter wants to move the greatest weight possible. I would know. I was a powerlifter and I've also been a bodybuilder. A bodybuilder wants to target working the muscle, an individual muscle, as much as possible. And that means possibly having to use less weight to target that muscle or even abandoning a barbell if you have to. Dorian understood something that many people just kind of overlook in high intensity training. Recovery is part of training. When fatigue accumulated, he didn't just keep pushing, he found a way to recover. He scheduled lighter training weeks before returning to maximum effort. And that understanding of recovery allowed him to maintain his incredibly intense style of training programs. He was willing to take breaks when he needed to and listened to his body. Today, modern research supports several aspects of Dorian's approach. Performing challenging sets close to failure is a very effective way to build muscle. Intelligent exercise selection matters. Machines can be just as effective as free weights for hypertrophy when used appropriately. And planned recovery is essential for long-term progress. And at the same time, Dorian's success does not mean that everyone should train exactly like he did. Like every Mr. Olympian, he had an extreme physique, extreme genetics, knowledge, experience that many people simply don't have. What it does demonstrate, though, is that there's more than one path to an elite physique. Perhaps most importantly, though, Dorian showed that high-intensity training doesn't have to be as extreme as Mike Mentzer's approach took. He kept the maximum effort, but paired it with intelligent exercise selection, proper preparation, and recovery management. Unfortunately, once high-intensity training reached the internet, all of those nuances and details were lost. Yay. Arthur Jones introduced HIT as an alternative to excessive volume training. Mike Mentzer expanded those ideas, and Dorian Yates proved that they could produce championship-level results. But as HIT spread through the books, internet forums, and eventually social media, many of its original ideas became more extreme. Instead of refining the original ideas, many people pushed the ideas of Jones further and further and further away from what was originally intended. Instead of asking how much training should we do, they started asking how little training can we do and get away with it, basically. Many online HIT advocates argue that one heavy set is literally all you need. That's insane to me, but, you know. The internet. Warm-up sets were often dismissed as unnecessary. Exercise selection became more limited. Training frequency became lower and lower and lower. It's this low. Can you see me? Really low. And then some people even said, if you stopped seeing progress, don't change up the program, train less. Please help me understand that one. Some people, instead of training even just once a week, they were stretching it to like once every 10 days to get their muscle to grow. And ironically, this often created the very problem that they were trying to avoid. Muscle growth depends on both recovery and repeated stimulation. If recovery is complete, but it's not done enough, then muscle growth stalls because it's not being pushed frequently enough. Stimulus needs to be frequent. One reason this happened is that people confused intensity with exhaustion. The harder a workout became, the longer they thought they needed to recover. Eventually, the programs became so intense and so infrequent with training that it became practically impossible for anyone to perform these exercises that were performing naturally without any juice assistance. And then there was another form of HIT movement that happened in the 1990s called super slow by Ken Hutchins. Super slow took controlled repetitions to an extremely new level. So instead of lifting weight in 1 or 2 seconds, it would take 10 seconds to lift and 10 seconds to return. I mean, really slow, aka super slow. Supporters at the time believed that this reduced stress on the joints and still helped grow the muscle through the tension over time. So although you do need to control your weight, and then that part is very important, the research now has shown that that just doesn't stimulate the growth like they thought it did. And the reason is simple. When training becomes that slow, I'm not talking controlled slow, but like 10 seconds up, 10 seconds down, you know, the eccentric and all of that, when it's that slow, you have to use less weight, which just means there's less fatigue to the muscle. You're reducing overall training stimulus. That doesn't mean that like slow repetitions never have value by any means. Like I love going controlled, and first of all, there is a sweet spot to be in, and controlled does matter. And there are times when super slow could be good. So, for example, like if you're healing from an injury, super slow training can help that muscle recover. And it can possibly allow you to continue training through that injury. Obviously, talk to a doctor if that's something you're experiencing. But it's one way that this might be used in a technique and be very, very beneficial for some people. Around that same time, another popular idea called hard gainer got some popularity. The original message was actually very reasonable. It encouraged natural lifters to use reasonable programs, to focus on progressive overload and stop copying the intense workouts of the elite bodybuilders that are not so natural. And over time, the movement started drifting to the extreme, like everything, right? Some lifters responded to training stalls through less frequency and less training. And then they would often see poor results and blame their genetics instead of reconsidering their program a little. There was another variation by Doug McGuff in the 2000s, Body by Science. McGuff argued that a single week all-out workout, total body workout, could perform enough exercise for the whole body to grow and get the muscle growth it needed with the stimulus. And while highly efficient for maybe extremely busy people, it does emphasize that whole less is better idea. And it missed the whole notion that science has really repeatedly come back to again and again and again. Recovery matters, but so does exposing muscles to a consistent, frequent training stimulus. And today, decades later, the picture is painted with much more balanced nuance of both sides, which is good. I like balance. Studies show that training consistently close to failure does build muscle stimulus growth. It shows that muscle can grow over a variety of wide training volumes and frequencies. And most importantly, no single variable determines success. Volume, intensity, frequency, exercise selection, they all work together. If you increase one, often another one needs to change. It's often why modern coaches don't debate whether high intensity training or high volume training is better. Instead, they're going to ask like a better question, like better for whom? A bodybuilder, a powerlifter, a busy mom with 30 minutes are all going to have very different answers to that question. And someone that's recovering from an injury is separate from that group as well. The most effective program balances these ideas for the individual rather than just following one single philosophy to an extreme. So was high intensity training decades ahead of its time? My answer would be yes, but only if we're talking about Arthur Jones's original idea, not what came later. He challenged the idea that more work automatically means more muscle. Mike Mentzer reminded people that effort matters. And Dorian Yates proved that shorter, brutal, hard workouts could build one of the greatest physiques in bodybuilding history. And those lessons are still valuable today. At the same time, some versions of HIT push these ideas just simply too far. Reducing training volume can be beneficial. Reducing it to nothing or practically nothing isn't beneficial. Training hard is important. But believing that every set must be taken to the extreme absolute failure is not supported by modern research. One of the biggest misconceptions around HIT is that training to failure is either like absolutely essential or completely unnecessary. The evidence suggests that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Training to failure is a tool. Used strategically, it can be incredibly effective, especially on safer isolation exercises or when overall training volume is low. But taking every compound lift to the absolute failure for absolutely every single workout usually takes you just to a fatigue more than is beneficial. Perhaps the greatest lesson of HIT isn't that everyone should train like Mike Mentzer or Dorian Yates. It's learning what true muscle failure actually feels like can make you a better lifter. Many people believe they're pushing as hard as they possibly can when they still have a few more reps left in their tank. Spending a few weeks learning how to absolutely hit true muscle failure in a safe environment with a coach or with someone that knows what they're doing. Please don't just do this because I said so, but might be a good idea to figure out what that actually feels like. It can really benefit your program if you know what true absolute failure looks like. I've showed this picture a million times, but you can see me lifting here in powerlifting when I was in high school. I did not get this lift, but you can see I'm about to poop myself. I am lifting to absolute true failure. A lot of people don't know what that absolute true failure actually feels like. If you do that once or twice, true failure, it can kind of help you gauge stopping 1 or 2 reps before that, which is really that sweet spot. You don't have to go to the absolute extreme true failure, but many people think they're stopping 1 or 2 reps before, but they're really stopping 4 or 5 reps before true failure. So if you know what true failure feels like, then you'll be able to maybe better gauge what that 1 or 2 reps before it is. And modern exercise science shows that there's no one true variable that exists by itself. Volume, intensity, frequency, exercise selection, and recovery all matter in this little world of fitness and physique building. So if intensity increases, volume typically needs to decrease. If training volume is high, not every set needs to reach to failure. If you train more frequently, then every set and training session doesn't have to be as demanding. And every successful training program, whether it's high intensive training, if you're looking at a powerlifting, a bodybuilding program, any program that you see that's successful will incorporate all of this information. The variables need to stay in balance. The biggest mistake isn't choosing one training style over the other. The biggest mistake is borrowing pieces from different systems without understanding how they all work together. I mean, looking back, high intensity training changed how we see bodybuilding and that world like forever. It changed the conventional wisdom of simply do more work to make the work count, which is really cool. And some of its ideas have stood the test of time. Others have been refined or challenged by modern research. But maybe that's the biggest lesson of them all. Like, there isn't a perfect program. Great training isn't about just choosing one camp. It's about understanding the principles behind different programs and applying them, understanding the techniques and figuring out how they work in your lifestyle, how they work for your body, and how to adjust when you need to. And hopefully you can take this information and apply it not only now, but whenever the next trend online comes on that's taking something to the extreme, because if history has taught us anything, they always will. I'm Barbells at Bedtime. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe. And I've got some free workouts for you guys if you want, or some other information about bodybuilding and just my tips and knowledge. And I do fun challenges with my husband. Mwah. I hope I taught you something. You guys have a great day.